All right. So this morning, I'm extremely excited to introduce Dr. Jon Zelner. Dr. Zellner is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. He received his PhD in sociology and public policy from the University of Michigan, and subsequently carried out a number of prestigious postdoctoral fellowships, including the rapid one he mentioned, at Princeton, Columbia, and Yale universities. And his research focuses on understanding and targeting the joint social and biological drivers of infectious disease risk. And his work blends theory and methods from sociology and epidemiology with an emphasis on the development and use of novel computational and statistical methods for integrating these types of data. His work covers a broad range of infections with a primary focus on respiratory infections, including tuberculosis, influenza, and of course now COVID-19, as well as thinking about vaccine preventable diseases and diarrheal diseases. I'll highlight just a few of his COVID-19 studies over the past year. He undertook a really interesting study looking at how initial data from congregate, or I guess how initial data from congregate settings could bias the impact of interventions, because there's a tendency to observe these large outbreaks that can lead to kind of overconfidence in how effective interventions actually are. They carried out a review looking at inequality in acute respiratory infection, and also proposed a few methods to actually kind of augment that literature. They also identified racial disparities in coronavirus disease risk, finding that they were that the mortality disparities are driven primarily by unequal infection risks rather than anything else systematic. And finally, something that I actually hadn't seen before I started looking through all of the papers, really a tour de force on discussing several issues of statistical design, data collection, analysis, communication, and decision-making that has kind of arisen in coronavirus studies. And they focused on kind of tools for assessment and propagation of uncertainty. And this was a paper with, I think it was Andrew Gelman, which, really interesting kind of broad review of a lot of issues with statistical analyses from previous studies. So I would recommend everyone take a look at that if they get a moment. And so we're really excited to have him here today. So please feel free to take away, Dr. Zellner.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Spencer, and thanks for having me. So first off, can everybody hear me okay? I always want to make sure no headphones have died in the interim and so forth. So hopefully you can see my screen reasonably well. I know the slides are ever so slightly smaller than they would ideally be, but this way I can actually see them. I can see you while I look at them. So hopefully this will work. And if you can't see them, just let me know. So, what I want to do today is to really kind of zoom in a little bit on that sort of synthesis question, of where, the ways we think about social inequality in the social sciences, but in social epidemiology really intersect with the kinds of models that, we use for thinking about transmission dynamics. And so what I'm going to do is to very briefly summarize some of the work that Spencer mentioned about racial disparities in COVID-19 incidence and mortality in Michigan, just to give a little bit of background for the next piece, which is a kind of interactive thought experiment that I'm going to send you guys a link in the chat that we can all go to. That's like a Shiny app where we can kind of play with some of the mechanisms that might underlie some of the disparities that we see in COVID incidents, but also across a broad spectrum of infectious diseases. And then if there's time at the end, just sort of talking about the implications of this for 2021 and beyond, because the data that I'm going to show you right now really come from that first phase of the pandemic, that come from that, what in Michigan we called the stay home, stay safe period from March to June, and where the inequalities were most evident, but it's really a moving target, and we're trying to kind of follow the ball as it moves, particularly into this phase of vaccination. Okay. And also, so I'll keep an eye on the chat, but often it's just easier if you can just unmute and interrupt me. I'm totally happy if if you have a question, because it's sometimes easy to miss. So first off, I just wanted to mention that everything that I'll talk about is really a product of a group effort of my research group and our collaborators. And this has been, as it has been, I'm sure for you guys, quite a year that's changed the way we work, changed the way we think about what we do, and what's important and what's not. So back in April of 2020, we were approached by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to do some descriptive mapping of COVID-19 incidence and mortality in Michigan. And so we created this website, covidmapping.org, that essentially is just a way of kind of visualizing the spatial shifts in the pandemic over time. And so, one of the things that becomes immediately obvious, when you look at this, particularly if you're familiar at all with the sort of social geography of a state like Michigan, which is defined by racial residential segregation, is that the spatial patterns reflect huge race, ethnic, and income disparities. More than most places, I think Michigan is characterized by what we would think of as a very macro scale racial segregation, in which the large majority of the sort of geographic area of the state is predominantly white, but there's a very large African American population in Southeast Michigan, particularly in the Detroit metropolitan area. And so, if we drill down on those individual level data that we've been lucky enough to have some access to, and I'll zoom in on this table, we can see that at the beginning of the pandemic, the incidence rate ratio for African Americans as compared to whites, and obviously there are other disparities here, but I'm going to focus in on this one for the time being, was almost 6 to 1, right? So essentially for every one case among whites, this is age and sex standardized, but the raw data aren't very different. There were nearly 6 among African Americans in the state. And if we look at that in mortality terms, it's even more stark. So for every 1 death among whites in the state, there was nearly 7 among African Americans, right? And one of the first questions that we engaged with was this one that Spencer mentioned, which is, what can explain these differences, right? Because I think at the beginning of this, there was a lot of, there were a lot of ideas floating around that there were differences in comorbidities between whites and non-whites that might be giving rise to some of these disparities. But there are also kind of crackpot sort of racialized theories about like differential susceptibility as a function of genetic variation and so forth. And so we really wanted to kind of get to the nut of what was actually going on with these disparities in Michigan. And because we had access to very low level data, we could do that. So, essentially, and I'll skip over the kind of gory details, but because we were able to look at age-specific risks of infection and disease, we could see that the age-specific incidence of COVID-19, particularly among older African Americans, was astronomically higher than it was among whites. And we saw similar patterns in other groups, but the shift towards the upper end of the age spectrum was particularly pronounced for African Americans. And so we did a little thought experiment where we substituted the incidence rates for whites, the age-specific incidence rates for whites during this period for those of African Americans. And if you did that, you would see about an 83% reduction in mortality among Blacks in Michigan, right? So this sort of kind of gets to the idea that what we're seeing is something that's driven primarily by exposure rather than these kind of, essentialist differences in terms of case fatality. It's not to say that there's no difference in case fatality rates between race ethnic groups. If you did this in reverse and you substituted white case fatality rates for those of Blacks, you would see about a 29% decrease in mortality. And these are kind of hitting different parts of the age distribution. So it's not a one-to-one comparison for that reason. And these risks are shifted a bit more down the age spectrum. So obviously there are differences on both scores, and we can speculate about why those might arise. But ultimately, it seems like the predominant driver of these inequalities is really exposure. Okay. So, as somebody who kind of comes from a social science background, but has been splashing around in the pool of infectious disease modeling for a long time now, it's we know that mechanisms are kind of where it's at, right? Like we want to understand how is this impacting transmission? How's this impacting progression of disease? And race is not really a very useful tool in and of itself for getting at that. First of all, race is obviously not a causal or modifiable factor. And it often lends itself to behavioral and genetic explanations rather than material ones, right? Where material explanations might be about resources that people have access to, housing and so forth, access to healthcare, rather than these things about individual people's bodies and behaviors. There's also some interesting research that shows that racializing risk in this way can be stigmatizing, and it can lead to neglect. I think we saw that pretty clearly in the early part of the pandemic with the Trump administration's response, which part of it was kind of a stick your head in the sand, try to ignore the problem response. And part of it was saying, oh, it's actually affecting these people. And so the people we care about are not affected, ergo, it's not a problem. And ultimately, focusing on these kind of individual level labels obscures these underlying mechanisms like residential and occupational segregation. So I just tell a very brief anecdote as to like how we ended up here. A long time ago, I was working on a TB project where we were looking at historical TB mortality data from the US. And I made this really nice figure that showed that as cities became more segregated in the early part of the 20th century, the differential in Black and white TB mortality increased. And I showed it to my postdoc mentor at Columbia, Peter Behrman, who's a sociologist. And he's like, this measure of segregation is doing a lot of work for you. He's like, what does segregation actually do in the context of transmission? And I kind of put the figure away and I never finished the paper, and it kind of stuck in my brain, right? And this crisis was really the ideal moment to come back and kind of try and readdress this question. So I think, we've seen some of these explanations for what might explain disparities in exposure, things like the prevalence of essential work among non-whites and lower income individuals, multi-generational households or household crowding, particularly among folks of lower socioeconomic status, mass incarceration. And when we think about segregation, we're really thinking about something that encompasses these and other factors that impact exposure risk and susceptibility to infection and severity and death. Okay. So what I want to do here is just pause for a moment, and I'll give you a chance to load up this shiny app. With luck, it will let everybody in. We did shell out for an institutional account, so it should work, but every now and again, it gives you a little hiccup. So I'll just give you a minute to kind of cue that up and read the first sort of intro bit, and then we'll walk through these steps of this tutorial, which are just kind of about exploring a model that lets us think a little bit more mechanistically about these relationships between residential segregation and disease disparities.
So do we go to next topic after we finish the first page?
Sure, you can. Okay. Yeah. Here, and I'm going to reload it too.
Okay.
And hopefully it will let me on. Okay. Cool. So are people able to? So Lauren, you're in. Okay. So what's going on here is I wanted to put something together that builds on this framework that was developed by Dolores Acevedo Garcia, who is at Tufts. And she wrote this paper about 20 years ago, looking at the relationship between different measures of racial residential segregation and infectious disease disparities. And she was really thinking about tuberculosis, which is what really first drew my attention to this paper. But ultimately, when we talk about segregation, what I think we're talking about is a process that does two things. It sorts people spatially and impacts their contacts within and between groups, right? And I think that's a kind of classic way we think about it when we put these patterns on a map. Or for those of us who played with things like the Schelling model, right? That's kind of what it's doing. It's sorting people into space. But the other thing that the segregating process really does is it allocates vulnerability, right? And it's that correlation between vulnerability and contact that is what I want to kind of get at with this. And and the notion of segregation in the United States, we often think of it in these racialized terms, and in the classic literature on urban inequality, which is focused on cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit. We think about black-white segregation, these big macro patterns, but I think obviously this is a much more complex issue within the United States. Clearly in Texas, you have a whole other set of dynamics. In California, we see more complex patterns of white, Latino, Asian American, and so forth. And also, I think this extends beyond the US, right? It's all about any place where you see concentrations of vulnerability and separations of contact. So that can be informal settlements in places like Rio and so forth, right? So I think of this as a general process, and this is a specific case. So if we click over to the next page, you can take a second to look at this. I'll kind of give a little synopsis while you guys are sort of peering at it. Essentially, she puts together this framework that says, okay, there are all these different ways that we measure the segregation of people in a particular environment. So the kind of classic one, at least in the demography literature, is the Index of Dissimilarity, which is a kind of measurement of unevenness. Essentially, it scales from 0 to 1, and it says, okay, 0 means that everybody's just randomly distributed. 1 means that the groups are perfectly separated. And she says that's all well and good, but it doesn't really get at the thing that's important for transmission. And so isolation is a nice measure that's actually popped up in some interesting COVID work as well, that lets you think about the proportion of contacts that the minority group has with other members of that group, right? And 1 minus that is the interaction, right? And so this paper has these, what I think of as really good examples of like what a simple figure can do, kind of showing you what low isolation looks like, where we have the green minority group and the red majority group. High isolation, where the majority group's contacts are completely segregated within that. Minority group's contacts are completely segregated within that group. And then the interaction of concentration or density and contact separation, right? So we have not only more contacts within than between groups, but we also have a higher rate of transmission or susceptibility within those groups. And one really important thing to remember too is that when we say random mixing, we don't mean 0 isolation, right? We should expect people to contact with each other, in a randomly mixed population at a frequency that's proportional to their population share, right? So an isolation of 0 means a kind of anti-segregation. So in the examples here, you can get to that, but it's not typically the kind of thing that we think about as happening in these contexts. So this first thing is just here to give you a sense of, what an individual's kind of grab bag of contacts might look like under different regimes of, population representation and isolation. So when you move the sliders around, what you get here is the interaction between the minority and majority population. And then you get the interaction of the majority with the minority, right? So one thing that's really important is these are asymmetric, right? That you can have, the minority group can have the large majority of its contacts with the majority group, particularly if it's a small fraction of the population, and still be pretty isolated. And so you can kind of draw example contact networks just to get a feel for what it would look like from either perspective to have 100 contacts from the majority or the minority group. So hopefully this just kind of gives you a concrete sense of what that looks like. So far, so good? Okay. So if you click over to the next page, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. And we're just going to use a very simple SIR framework to think about how this plays out in terms of transmission. So we have our two groups. I'm not going to give you guys the full rundown on what an SIR model is, but essentially, we're asking this question of what happens when we take those contact patterns that I just showed you in the previous thing and superimpose it on the natural history of infection, in this case, in a very idealized way. And so if you slide down to here, you can see this model. And essentially what we have are these dials, which are telling you the overall R naught that changes as a function of, just the beta, the average infectiousness of a given case. And then what this shows you is the number of cases in the population you would expect from introducing one case into the minority group or one case into the majority group. And so my task for you guys in playing around with this is to see how you can set it up to generate the greatest inequality as measured by this relative risk between groups. So the dashed lines here are the maximum number of cases you can get from either group. But this relative risk is on the rate scale. So this is per 100,000 or what have you. And so, as you play around with it, think about the balance of vulnerability to isolation to infectiousness. And I'm just kind of curious, if you want to put in the chat or unmute, if you can find particular regimes of the parameter space, in the limited amount of time we have to just kind of toggle the sliders around a little bit, that do increase that disparity, at least as measured by the relative risk.
Can you explain again what the relative risk metric is calculating?
Oh yeah, 100%. So down here we have, these are per capita incidences, right? And essentially it's just the ratio of the per capita incidences. So, obviously if you have these, if you have these two populations of different sizes, we want to make a rate scale kind of comparison. I sort of struggled with the best way to present this, because if you put them all on the rate scale on the figure, then you can't see the lines. So I put them back on the kind of natural scale. But I might go back to having like two panels or something. But does that make sense, Spencer?
Yes.
Cool.
I'm not sure what I did. I got a relative risk above 20. It's
okay.
20. Oh, wait. Okay, never mind. It's just because there's no incidence.
Right. Well, so, but that's okay. That's the type of insight that I think is not out of bounds for this, right? Like, think about I think focusing in on these kind of relative effects of introducing a case into either of these populations is a kind of instructive thing to look at. So here it's like, this is giving you, the minority group here has a pretty high incidence, right? Like a 68%, right? Obviously this is kind of off the charts, but the majority group is quite low, right? And you can get that by having essentially a fairly high vulnerability within that group. And yeah, so Jennifer is saying it seems like concentration is more significant to increasing risk than isolation, right? So I think that's exactly right. And, to me, as somebody who kind of came up thinking about, segregation as this process of separation, even though I kind of, if you write out the model, it becomes kind of apparent that, yeah, this isolation doesn't do anything on its own, right? Like, it doesn't really matter how much contact is happening within and between groups if the vulnerabilities of each group is the same. It might as well just be a kind of well-mixed, well-mixed population. So to me, the kind of the key insight was that. So Brian, you're saying that they have a maximum at 0.25? I don't think so. Right, so it seems like there's a kind of sweet spot where you keep the infectiousness low enough. Oh, I see. Right. So right, you have to keep the infectiousness on average kind of low enough that you can prevent large outbreaks within the majority group, and and then the concentration within the majority group kind of amps up risk. And here, concentration is thought of as the risk of infection for an exposure from within or outside of that group, right? So if it was only within the group, it would just be a multiplier on the within group transmission rate, really. But because we're thinking of this in more vulnerability terms, which I think is a debatable question, it's really about exposures from outside and inside. And so to me, as something for thinking about, as a kind of intuition pump for thinking about inequality in the context of the pandemic, if we think about the differences in the availability of working from home, having your groceries delivered, right? Like we can kind of think of these as sets of mechanisms that are sorting some people into the kind of essential workplace where there's greater exposure, who potentially have greater underlying vulnerabilities for one reason or another, while another group is kind of able to shelter and keep that kind of within group effective R near or less than 1. Obviously, this is really focusing in on that first period, and this is just very much a toy model. But for me at least, it kind of built this intuition that it can't only be about contact. It really has to be at the intersection of contact or contact separation and vulnerability. Okay. So any other kind of questions, right? And so Brian, your question I think is true, that it's like if you go above a certain level in that infectiousness, then you're going to have everybody get infected and you're going to kind of run in the opposite direction. And so I do think, when we think about pathogens as kind of sitting on a spectrum in terms of their ability to really expose disparities, the kind of underlying infectiousness becomes really important, right? I don't want to be kind of a social determinist and saying it's only the contact patterns, right? If we think about letting measles out into a fully susceptible population, that's probably going to look very different than something like COVID, which is kind of floating in the sweet spot, for generating inequality. And in my own mind, I always thought if we ever did see a novel respiratory disease pandemic, it would be, something that would be just blowing through the population and that would not expose disparities in quite the way that it has. But I think that's a testament both to, the characteristics of this particular pathogen and our ability to, generate disparities everywhere we kind of clump around with our existing social and healthcare systems. Right, I don't know if the disease is bad enough, is it really an equalizer? I think it has to be really bad and really hard to escape and really fast. I think otherwise, like we're pretty good at building the structures to keep some people safe and some people less safe. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the slides. I know we're kind of approaching time, so I'm happy to kind of pivot towards more of a Q&A, or I can just talk about a few couple of things to kind of wind up.
Go ahead and yeah, we'd love to hear the rest of your slides, and we should still have some time for Q&A. That'd be great.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about, so now we're in 2021, we're seeing some positive movement in some ways, but obviously backsliding in other ways when we think about lifting of mask mandates in Texas, but also, in Michigan, we have restaurants opening, I think at a pace that's like, why do we need to do this when we could wait another month and so forth? So we might still be taking our foot off the brake a little too fast. So we have to really think about what we need to do to achieve sustained reductions in these disparities in incidence and mortality. Obviously, a huge part of that is equitable distribution and uptake of vaccination. I think another part of it is that even as the kind of instantaneous inequality passes, we're going to see inequity in the long-term effects of this in terms of, some of this is, long-term cardiac or neurological complications of COVID infection. Some of it is also the economic fallout which isn't going to be patched up by the stimulus alone. And then, of course, there's other gaps in global and domestic health equity that have exploded because of diversions of resources, right? So even as we start to solve one part of this problem, it has created a number of problems that are going to reverberate for realistically for decades. The good news is that these disparities in incidence and mortality, at least the ones that I just talked about, do appear to have decreased, at least in Michigan. But it's not, we want to be careful not to kind of plant our sort of mission accomplished flag too soon. So this is a nice figure that Ramya Narharisetti in my group and also Nina Masters made, showing change in incidence for African Americans versus whites and for Latinos versus whites in Michigan from March of last year until the end of 2020. And what you see is that there's a kind of convergence in the rates over the summer for Blacks and whites, but some of that convergence comes from an increase in the denominator. And I think that, this is another thing that we have to really think about when we're making these equity comparisons. The pace at which these disparities closed looked a lot better and was kind of trumpeted in a lot of press releases in Michigan. Because of the fact that the rates for whites were going up drastically. And I don't know that that necessarily represents a win for anybody, right?
Well, sorry, John, what do you mean by the denominator? What denominator are you talking about here?
Sure, so the denominator in this case being the white rate. So like in Michigan, there was a lieutenant governor who's been running a really important task force on racial inequality. And so one of the things that they do is they kind of monitor the rate ratio in Black versus white cases in the state. And so, so they're really using this risk ratio metric to kind of make policy and to evaluate it. And so in September, they were like, well, we converged to a rate ratio of 1 for Black versus white incidence and mortality. And of course, that's true. It is an empirical fact, and rates for African Americans broadly did go down, but there are a lot of reasons that could be that are not so salubrious, right? So people who have died are not in the denominator anymore, and a lot of these estimates come from just using the census population going back to maybe the 2010 census as a denominator. So it's hard to know how much of this is a function of kind of screwy population data. And ultimately, if rates are going up on the aggregate, it doesn't mean that we've done a great job. And then the other thing is that there's been a real shift in the age of the cases and in who's getting infected. So while African American rates were going down, rates among Latinos, who are not as large a share of the population, but a significant and growing share in Michigan, have gone up and have continued to remain high. And that disparity has continued to increase going into 2021. Right, so this is really very much a moving target. So once we, just because one comparison has gotten better doesn't mean that we've kind of attacked the problem of inequity. And these disparities in case fatality now are really much more impactful because the average age of infection has decreased. So, whereas, when we were talking about this concentrated kind of, high speed transmission, particularly through older individuals, the disparities in case fatality were important, but less of a driver than disparities in exposure. But now as the age distribution has shifted downward, I think we're starting to see that this is becoming more and more of an issue, even as the overall rates fall. And so we're doing some work on that right now to actually kind of rigorously get at this. And finally, vaccination, of course, is positive news, but we're likely to see these disparities increase, at least in those relative terms, if vaccine access and uptake remain as inequitable as they have been. And I think, there are important questions too about the sort of medium to long-term management here, because we're not necessarily talking about just getting a one and done or two and done kind of jab, but we might be talking about boosters and all of that. So when we're thinking about people being connected to the healthcare system, being trustful of it, being able to get the shots for free, which right now is more or less guaranteed, but may not be in the future. These are all things I think we need to kind of have in at least the back of our minds as we go forward. So I'm just going to skip this one. So finally, I would say my kind of overall argument here, and something that I think has become just incredibly apparent for me in this year, is that we can't think of equity as a kind of afterthought that we kind of graft onto the models that we use. The mechanisms that drive inequality, like segregation, really need to be integral rather than ancillary to transmission, right? And so we need to have a kind of an approach to this that's motivated by both the biological and epidemiologic literature, but also that takes a kind of considered perspective from the social science literature. And I think one way of thinking about this is that these kind of inequalities are really a manifestation of heterogeneity, right? And so in the context of the pandemic, we've thought about heterogeneity in terms of super spreaders, right? And often super spreaders, that long tail of transmission is very newsy, and it can be epidemiologically important. But often, you know, the bulk of the variance that matters is kind of more clumpy, and it's about different groups interacting. And taking this kind of hierarchical perspective lets us take, sorry, my dog is entering the room. I don't know if you can see him. Like take a more kind of causal perspective by thinking about what it is that's driving that heterogeneity, rather than thinking that it's just kind of random variation, which I think had started out as we were thinking about this, partially because it was just a kind of revolution in the way that people thought about that variability, either in network epidemiology work, which often is more motivated by, you know, by individual kind of social factors, or the kind of Lloyd-Smith framework of thinking about, you know, variability across the population, right? So this isn't in any way a critique of any of that, but more a suggestion that we kind of need to be moving in the direction of kind of synthesizing these things together and thinking about the kind of social and environmental mechanisms that lead to that variation. So yeah, I'll pause there, and you know, happy to take any questions.